The air hung thick with the scent of splintered wood and damp earth, as if the tornado had torn open the world's secrets and left them bleeding into the dusk. Ben stood amid the ruins of his barn, his calloused hands sifting through twisted metal and shattered glass, each piece a shard of his fractured life. Sophie, small and unyielding at 9, clutched a mud-streaked doll to her chest, her wide eyes reflecting the gray sky like forgotten ponds. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant creak of settling debris, a lullaby for the broken. Ben's breath came shallow, his mind a fog of exhaustion, wondering if this was the storm that would finally claim him. Then a faint whimper sliced through the quiet, raw and insistent, pulling his gaze toward the shadowed edge of the field. Something stirred there, alive in the devastation, a whisper of fate in the wreckage. The rural town sprawled like a corpse under the bruised sky, its fields gouged into muddy scars where ancient oaks had been uprooted like teeth from a jaw. Ben's modest home stood half-crumpled shingles, peeled away like flayed skin, exposing the skeletal frame beneath. The wind whispered through the gaps, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and distant rain, a reminder that the storm's fury might return. Sophie wandered closer to a fallen barn, her fingers tracing odd carvings on the weathered wood, swirling symbols that seemed etched by no human hand, glowing faintly in the fading light. She shivered not from the chill, but from the unnatural hum vibrating through the ground, like the earth itself was murmuring warnings. Ben dismissed it as aftershocks, his resilient facade cracking just a fraction, but internally a knot tightened in his gut. The tornado felt less like nature's rage and more like a harbinger unleashing shadows that watched from the tree line. There, amid the tangled barbed wire and splintered fences, a dark silhouette emerged, a German shepherd fur matted with blood and mud eyes piercing the gloom with an intensity that bordered on the ethereal, as if it had clawed its way from the storm's heart to find them. Ben's knees buckled slightly as he knelt beside a splintered beam, his fingers closing around a cracked photo frame that had somehow survived the chaos. The image inside Lily's smile, frozen in time, her arms wrapped around a laughing toddler. Sophie hit him like a gust from the receding storm, stirring the ashes of grief he'd buried deep. Why fight this any more? He thought, the words echoing in the hollow chamber of his mind, where resilience had long ago turned to rust. His breath hitched not in sobs, but in shallow mechanical pulls, as if his body had forgotten how to feel without shattering. Sophie approached quietly, her small hand resting on his shoulder, a feather against the weight of his isolation. But even that touch felt distant, like sunlight through storm clouds. Internally, the numbness spread like frost over glass, cracking his resolve. He was a man adrift in his own wreckage, questioning if survival was just prolonged suffering. The dog's distant whimper pulled at him again, a thread in the unraveling fabric of his defenses, but he pushed it away, fearing any new attachment would only invite more loss. Sophie's finger extended toward the silhouette in the debris, her voice a whisper laced with wonder. "Daddy, look, there's a dog." Ben followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing against the dim light, where the German shepherd stood like a sentinel forged from shadows and scars, its fur a tangled map of survival. The animal didn't cower or flee. Instead, it limped forward a step, its amber eyes locking onto Ben's with an intensity that pierced the veil of his numbness, as if peering into the storm raging within him. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer danced in those eyes like embers in a dying fire, dismissed by Ben as a trick of the twilight, but stirring an inexplicable pull in his chest. Storm, that name came unbidden to his mind, fitting the creature's unyielding stance amid the ruin. The moment hung suspended, a quiet promise that this dog carried more than wounds. It bore the weight of destinies intertwined, a harbinger of change whispering through the wind. Ben's mind drifted back as he stared at the photo frame, the edges cutting into his palm like forgotten regrets. Years ago, life had been a tapestry of warmth. Lily's laughter echoing through their sunlit kitchen, her hands flour-dusted from baking pies that smelled of cinnamon and home. They had built this place together, a sanctuary in the rural expanse where Ben's calloused hands from carpentry work felt purposeful, not just enduring. Sophie had come into the world on a crisp autumn day, her cries a melody that bound them tighter. But then the storm hit, not this one, but the one that stole Lily, whipping through like a vengeful spirit, tearing her from the road in a flash of twisted metal and rain-slicked asphalt. Ben had arrived too late, his screams lost in the thunder guilt embedding itself like shrapnel in his soul. Why hadn't he insisted she stay home? Resilience became his armor, forged in sleepless nights and mechanical routines, but it masked the void where vitality once thrived. Now, with Sophie as his anchor, he clung to the fragments, fearing that opening to anything new would shatter what little remained. The dog's eyes, watching from the debris, stirred something dormant, an echo of purpose he thought lost forever. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm for Ben, each one an echo chamber of emptiness wrapped in the guise of normalcy. Mornings began with the grind of coffee beans, the bitter steam rising like ghosts from his mug as he packed Sophie's lunch with mechanical precision. Apple slices, a sandwich, no notes of love since Lily's hand had penned them last. The drive to school was silent radio off his eyes, fixed on the road that had claimed his wife, the dashboard clock ticking like a countdown to nothing. Work at the local mill was rote labor sawdust clinging to his skin like unspoken sorrows, conversations with co-workers clipped and superficial, avoiding the pity in their glances. Evenings brought silent dinners, forks scraping plates in the dim kitchen light, Lily's chair empty like a wound that refused to scar. Sophie would chatter about school or her fanciful tales of guardian angels in the clouds, her words bouncing off Ben's fortified walls, irritating the numbness he relied on to survive. Bedtime stories were read with detached voice, his mind wandering to what-ifs, while he avoided the mirror in the hallway, unable to face the hollow-eyed stranger staring back. The house, once alive with laughter, now mirrored his inner void, a frozen tableau where emotions lay dormant, waiting for a crack to let the storm in. Storm's body told a tale of torment etched in every scar and hesitant step, his once sleek German shepherd frame now a canvas of betrayal and endurance. Born into the shadows of the Order of the Veil, an ancient clandestine society that bred guardians for prophecies long forgotten, he had been trained from puffhood in hidden enclaves where the air reeked of incense and whispered incantations. Handlers' cloaked figures with eyes like cold steel pushed him through trials of fire and illusion, teaching him to sense threats beyond human perception, the subtle shift in air before danger, the ethereal hum of mystical forces. His loyalty was forged in isolation, rewarded with sparse affection, but betrayal came swift when a rival faction within the Order deemed him expendable, casting him into a ritual storm meant to erase his existence. Clawing through the vortex, first singed and limbs torn, Storm emerged scarred, not just physically with jagged lines across his flank like lightning bolts frozen in flesh, but emotionally his trust shattered like glass under boot. Survival instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. He prowled the fringes of the world, mistrustful of hands that reached out his heightened senses, always scanning for the society's hunters. Now, in the tornado's aftermath, his amber eyes held a haunted depth, mirroring Ben's grief. A low growl escaped his throat at sudden noises, a survival mechanism that masked the yearning for purpose. Sophie approached slowly, her voice soft as she extended a hand, but Storm flinched, his body tensing like a coiled spring, the weight of his past pressing down heavier than any chain. Internally, a flicker of recognition stirred. He sensed in Ben a kindred brokenness, a soul adrift like his own, drawing him closer despite the fear. Yet betrayal's echo lingered, making every step toward them a battle against the instinct to flee, his protective nature warring with the pain that had turned him into a ghost of the guardian he was meant to be. In the dim light filtering through the cracked windows of Ben's home, the parallels between man and dog unfolded like shadows mirroring each other across a barren floor. Storm huddled in the corner, his massive frame curled tight, refusing the bowl of water Ben had placed nearby, his breaths shallow and guarded, much like Ben's own sleepless vigils, where food went untouched and nights stretched into voids of regret. Sophie noticed at first, her observant eyes darting between them, how Storm's flinch at a creaking floorboard echoed Ben's tense shoulders when thunder rumbled afar, both recoiling from echoes of loss that haunted their every move. Internally, Ben felt the resonance. His grief for Lily was a silent storm eroding him from within, just as Storm's scars spoke of a world that had chewed him up and spat him out, leaving only survival's hollow shell. Their healing began, not in grand gestures but in quiet presence. Ben sitting on the porch staring at the horizon, while Storm watched from afar, his ears perking at Sophie's soft hums, a tentative bridge over their shared abyss. Nonverbal cues wove the thread. Storm's subtle shift closer when Ben's hand trembled on the railing, mirroring the man's unspoken vulnerability. A glance exchanged in the quiet, acknowledging the pain without words. Sophie whispered stories to Storm about lost guardians finding their way, her intuition sensing the mirrored arcs as Ben's resilience masked his isolation. Storm's loyalty hid his mistrust, both souls navigating recovery in tandem, one hesitant step at a time. The bond grew through these silent recognitions, a fragile lattice of understanding that promised in time to fill the emptiness they both carried like invisible weights. The makeshift shelter hummed with chaos, a cacophony of barks and whimpers echoing off corrugated metal walls that still bore the dents of the tornado's wrath. Ben navigated the crowded aisles, his boots crunching over straw scattered like forgotten promises, the air thick with the musky scent of fear and wet fur. Sophie tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide as moons, pointing to a rusted crate in the corner where Storm huddled, his massive body pressed against the bars, ears flattened like wilted leaves. The dog's coat was a patchwork of mud-caked scars, his ribs visible under taut skin, and a tag on the crate read, "Euthanasia Scheduled Dawn," a death sentence ticking like a hidden clock. Sophie's voice broke through the din, a plea wrapped in intuition. "Daddy, that's the dog from the field. He needs us. Look at his eyes, they're like stars calling home." Ben froze, his gaze meeting Storm's amber stare, a jolt racing through him like lightning grounding in his chest. Those eyes held not just pain but an ancient knowing, stirring a visceral ache in his gut, as if the dog were a mirror to his own buried storms. The urgency pressed in the shelter volunteer's weary nod, the clamor of other animals vying for salvation building a tension that clawed at Ben's resolve. Sophie's hand in his, a fragile anchor amid the emotional gale. Ben's mind waged war in the dim shelter-light logic, barricading against the swell of empathy that Sophie's plea had unleashed. "We can't, Soph," he muttered, his voice gravelly, citing the litany of barriers, the vet bills that would strain their already threadbare budget, the cramped house still reeling from repairs, and the unspoken grief that made every new attachment feel like inviting another tornado. Internally, fear coiled like smoke in his chest. What if caring for this broken beast cracked open the vault where he kept Lily's memory, letting the pain flood out unchecked? Storm's faint whimper pierced the air, a soft arrow that lodged in Ben's defenses, his eyes drawn back to the dog's unblinking gaze, mirroring his own haunted isolation. Sophie's tears glistened, her small voice insistent. "He's like us, Daddy, lost but strong. What if he's meant to be ours?" The internal argument raged reason, clashing with the raw pull of compassion until the scales tipped the fear of regret, outweighing the fear of loss, forcing Ben to confront the vulnerability he'd armored against for so long. Ben's hand trembled as he gripped the pen, the shelter volunteer's form blurring before him like a contract with fate itself. "All right," he rasped, signing his name in a jagged scrawl, the ink bleeding slightly on the damp paper mirroring the messiness of his decision. Sophie bounced on her toes, her excitement a spark in the dim chaos, as the volunteer unlatched the crate with a metallic clank that echoed like a door slamming on doubt. Storm emerged hesitantly, his paws scraping the concrete body low and tense, a low whine escaping as Ben knelt, extending a hand, not in dominance, but in quiet offering. The dog paused, nose twitching at the scent of Ben's calloused palm. Sawdust and sweat mingled with unspoken sorrow before taking a single faltering step forward. It was imperfect. Storm's limp dragged Ben's knees, protested against the hard floor, and a nearby dog's bark startled them both, causing Storm to freeze mid-stride. But in that irreversible moment, as Sophie gently looped a makeshift leash around Storm's neck, whispering, "You're safe now," the commitment solidified, a raw tether binding their fractured worlds amid the shelter's lingering stench of desperation. The drive home was a symphony of silence, broken only by the hum of the truck's engine and Storm's shallow pants from the back seat, where he lay curled like a question mark on an old blanket. Ben glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting the dog's wary gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, both scarred survivors, stepping into unknown territory. At the house, Ben carried Storm inside the dog's weight, a tangible reminder of the burden he'd shouldered, placing him gently in a corner of the living room where shadows danced like hesitant allies. He filled a bowl with water and kibble scavenged from the pantry, pushing it forward with a foot, respecting the invisible barrier Storm's tense posture demanded. The dog eyed it suspiciously, his nose flaring, but after an eternity of stillness, he lapped tentatively, each swallow a fragile concession. Sophie knelt nearby, not too close, murmuring, "We'll take care of you, Storm, like family," her words weaving a vow into the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked fur. Ben felt the shift internally, a crack in his numbness, as Storm's ears perked slightly at his name, the act marking the dawn of healing, a messy promise of space and care, where trust would bloom from the ruins, one cautious glance at a time. Though doubts lingered like storm clouds on the horizon, this irreversible gesture bound them human and hound in a quiet pact against the world's tempests. The first days with Storm unfolded like a fragile truce in the dim confines of Ben's home, where silence hung heavy as fog rolling off the fields. Storm claimed a shadowed corner of the living room, his body a coiled statue of fur and muscle eyes, tracking every movement with the precision of a sentinel, guarding forgotten ruins. Ben moved deliberately, his footsteps muffled on the worn floorboards, respecting the invisible perimeter. The dog had drawn a low growl, rumbling like distant thunder whenever he ventured too close, a warning etched in the air's sudden chill. Internally, Ben recognized the echo. His own heart was similarly fortified walls built from grief's debris, growling inwardly at any intrusion that threatened to stir the settled dust of his solitude. Sophie hovered at the edges, her small frame a bridge between them, whispering observations like, "He's watching us, Daddy," like he's deciding if we're real. Her intuition piercing the tension without forcing it. The house, once a tomb of numbness, now pulsed with an odd vitality. The creak of settling wood amplified by Storm's alert ears, the scent of his damp fur mingling with the faint must of old books and Lily's lingering perfume. As the days blurred, Ben approached Storm with a bowl of warm water, an antiseptic, the steam rising like ghosts from wounds long ignored. Kneeling at a respectful distance, he soaked a cloth, the fabric absorbing the liquid with a soft sigh that mirrored his own hesitant breath. Storm tensed his body, flinching as Ben gently dabbed at a jagged scar on his flank, the touch eliciting a low whimper that echoed Ben's internal recoil, each twitch of the dog's muscle reminding him of his own emotional scars, raw and unhealed, flaring at the slightest probe. Internally, Ben thought, we're both patched together with threads that could snap the parallel, striking him like a shadow aligning with its source. Sophie sat nearby, cross-legged on the floor, tearing pieces of her sandwich and placing them midway between her and Storm, her eyes wide with unspoken empathy as the dog watched her closely, his nose twitching at the scent of cheese and bread. No words passed, but the shared suffering wove an invisible thread. Storm's wary acceptance of the food snatched with quick jaws mirrored Ben's reluctant sips of soup. During sleepless nights, both acts of survival laced with vulnerability. The moon hung low over the rural fields, casting a silvery veil through the cracked window panes of Ben's home, where shadows played like forgotten memories across the worn wooden floors. Storm had claimed his corner for weeks now, a fortress of solitude amid the clutter of half-repaired lives, his breaths syncing with the distant hoot of an owl, a rhythm of guarded existence. But tonight, as thunder grumbled on the horizon like an old grudge resurfacing, something shifted in the air, a charged stillness, heavy with the scent of impending rain and the faint earthy musk of Storm's fur. Sophie sat on the threadbare rug, her knees drawn up, reading aloud from a tattered book of myths, her voice a gentle current weaving tales of loyal beasts guarding ancient secrets. And the guardian wolf laid his head upon the child's lap, knowing his watch had found its heart. She whispered, her eyes flickering to Storm, who watched her from afar, his amber gaze softening like embers cooling in the hearth. The tranquility that had settled over Ben's home began to fray at the edges as night cloaked the rural fields in velvet darkness, the air thick with the chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. Storm, who had grown accustomed to curling beside Sophie on the rug, suddenly stiffened his ears, pivoting like radar toward the window, a low growl vibrating from deep within his chest like an underground tremor. Sophie paused, her drawing crayons hovering her intuitive gaze, following Storm's alert posture, the way his hackles rose subtly, body still as a statue carved from tension. Ben, nursing a coffee at the kitchen table, felt the shift too, the room's warmth cooling, as if an unseen draft had slipped through the cracks. Internally, he dismissed it as remnants of the tornado's paranoia, but Storm's instincts, honed by the Order's ancient rituals, sensed more a faint, unnatural hum in the air, like the prelude to a storm not born of weather. Flickering lights danced beyond the tree line, ethereal and erratic, catching Sophie's eye as she whispered, "Daddy, look fireflies, but wrong." Storm's growl deepened, his amber eyes fixed on the shadows stirring outside, primal awareness flaring at echoes of his past betrayers, foreshadowing a threat that crept closer, invisible yet insistent, turning their sanctuary into a stage for impending unrest. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting golden shards across the floor like fragmented memories scattered in the light. Ben sat at the table, his fingers absently tracing the rim of a chipped mug, the steam from his tea curling upward like whispers from the past. Storm lay nearby, no longer in his distant corner, but closer, his body a relaxed curve on the rag rug, eyes half-lidded in wary repose. Sophie entered quietly, her small hands cradling a soft cloth toy, a rabbit Lily had sewn years ago, its ears floppy and faded. She knelt beside Storm, extending the toy gently, not pushing, but offering her breath a soft hush in the room's stillness. Storm's nose twitched, inhaling the faint scent of lavender from the fabric, a trigger that stirred something deep within him. Memories of the Order's hidden groves, where similar herbs masked the pain of training sessions, his handlers' voices echoing commands in the mist. Twilight draped the backyard in hues of amber and indigo, the rural fields stretching like a canvas, painted with the day's fading light, crickets tuning their evening symphony. Sophie bounded outside, a rubber ball in hand, red and worn, unearthed from the shed where childhood relics gathered dust. "Come on, Storm!" She called, her voice a melody of unbridled joy, tossing the ball lightly across the grass, dew-kissed blades glistening like tears of renewal. Storm, who had followed them out with hesitant paws, tilted his head, ears perking at the ball's bounce, his scarred body shifting from guarded stance to curious alertness. Ben leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, his internal skepticism, whispering doubts. Would the dog engage or retreat to shadows? But as Sophie giggled, rolling the ball toward Storm, something ignited. The dog's tail wagged once tentatively, then with growing vigor, a playful spark flickering in his amber eyes like embers stirred from ash. Storm pounced lightly, his massive frame graceful, despite the limp, nosing the ball back toward Sophie with a gentle push, the motion coaxing her laughter, a sound pure and ringing, echoing off the barn like bells in a silent church. Ben felt it first in his chest, a warmth spreading like sunlight piercing storm clouds, his lips curving involuntarily into a smile that evolved into a chuckle, startling him with its foreign timbre. How long since laughter had escaped him, unforced and real? Internally, memories surfaced, Lily, chasing a younger Sophie through these same fields, their giggles blending with the wind, now revived in this moment of play. Storm bounded again, this time with a soft bark, not warning but delight, his fur catching the twilight glow scars, fading in the motion's blur. The moon hung low over the rural fields, casting a silvery veil through the cracked window panes of Ben's home, where shadows played like forgotten memories across the worn wooden floors. Storm had claimed his corner for weeks now, a fortress of solitude, amid the clutter of half-repaired lives, his breath sinking with the distant hoot of an owl, a rhythm of guarded existence. But tonight, as thunder grumbled on the horizon like an old grudge resurfacing, something shifted in the air, a charged stillness heavy with the scent of impending rain and the faint earthy musk of Storm's fur. Sophie sat on the threadbare rug, her knees drawn up, reading aloud from a tattered book of myths, her voice a gentle current, weaving tales of loyal beasts guarding ancient secrets. And the guardian wolf laid his head upon the child's lap, knowing his watch had found its heart. She whispered, her eyes flickering to Storm, who watched her from afar, his amber gaze softening like embers cooling in the hearth. The tranquility that had settled over Ben's home began to fray at the edges as night cloaked the rural fields in velvet darkness, the air thick with the chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. Storm, who had grown accustomed to curling beside Sophie on the rug, suddenly stiffened his ears, pivoting like radar toward the window, a low growl vibrating from deep within his chest like an underground tremor. Sophie paused, her drawing crayons hovering her intuitive gaze following Storm's alert posture, the way his hackles rose subtly body still, as a statue carved from tension. Ben, nursing a coffee at the kitchen table, felt the shift too, the room's warmth cooling as if an unseen draft had slipped through the cracks. Internally, he dismissed it as remnants of the tornado's paranoia, but Storm's instincts, honed by the Order's ancient rituals, sensed more a faint, unnatural hum in the air, like the prelude to a storm not born of weather. Flickering lights danced beyond the tree line, ethereal and erratic, catching Sophie's eye as she whispered, "Daddy, look fireflies, but wrong." Storm's growl deepened, his amber eyes fixed on the shadows stirring outside primal awareness, flaring at echoes of his past betrayers, foreshadowing a threat that crept closer, invisible yet insistent, turning their sanctuary into a stage for impending unrest. The evening settled over Ben's home like a soft shroud, the rural silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the distant call of a night bird. Lamplight flickered warmly in the living room, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls like whispers of forgotten tales. Sophie lounged on the floor, her back against the couch, a blanket draped over her legs as she flipped through a picture book of stars and legends, her voice murmuring softly about constellations that guarded the earth. Storm, who had gradually inched closer over the days, lay a few feet away, his massive body a dark silhouette against the rug ears twitching at every subtle sound, the drip of a faucet, the sigh of wind through the eaves. Ben sat in his armchair, a half-read newspaper forgotten in his lap, his eyes drifting to the scene before him, internally wrestling with the quiet transformation unfolding in his once empty space. How had this dog with his battle-worn frame and eyes like ancient amber become the axis around which their healing revolved? Doubt still lingered in Ben's chest, a shadow of fear that this fragile piece could shatter like glass underfoot. But the warmth building in the room chipped away at it, slow and insistent. Midnight cloaked the house in a velvet hush, the rural darkness absolute save for the faint glow of stars piercing the sky like distant warnings. Storm nestled at the foot of Sophie's bed, suddenly lifted his head, ears erect and quivering, a low growl rumbling from his chest, like thunder brewing underground. His body-tensed muscles coiling under scarred fur, amber eyes fixed on the window where moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Sophie stirred, rubbing her eyes, her intuitive whisper cutting the silence. "What is it, boy?" Ben, awake in the adjacent room with insomnia's grip, heard the sound and patted in his bare feet, cold on the wood, internally attributing it to wildlife but feeling a prick of unease. Storm's growl intensified, directed at the dark fields beyond, where subtle flickers, unnatural lights like will-o'-the-wisps danced along the tree line, too rhythmic to be fireflies. The air hummed faintly, an ethereal vibration that Storm's order-honed instincts recognized as harbingers of pursuit, his posture a statue of alertness, hackles rising like spines on a threatened beast. Sophie peered out, her face pale. "Lights, Daddy, they're moving." Ben dismissed it with a gruff, "Just reflections," but Storm's unwavering stare rekindled his doubt. The subtle tension coiling through the house like smoke signaling that shadows from the past were stirring a threat looming invisible, yet inexorable. The knock came sharp and unexpected, echoing through the house like a crack in the fragile peace they'd built, the rural afternoon sun casting long shadows across the porch. Ben opened the door, his frame filling the threshold to find a stranger standing there, a man in a nondescript coat, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses, his smile too polished, too rehearsed. "I'm looking for a dog," the man said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "A German shepherd that survived the tornado. Named Storm, I believe. He belongs to old friends. Sophie's hand tightened on Ben's shirt from behind her intuition, flaring like a warning bell, while Storm, lounging in the hall, surged forward with a ferocity that shattered the calm, a snarl ripping from his throat deep and primal hackles raised like spines of fury, body low and ready to strike. Ben's protective instincts ignited a blaze in his chest, his arm instinctively barring Sophie as he stepped forward, voice booming, "Get off my property. He's ours now." But the stranger's words clawed at memories, triggering a cascade in Ben's mind, flashbacks to the night Lily died. The storm's roar drowning his screams as he pulled her from the wreckage, too late. Always too late. The guilt paralyzing him anew. Storm's aggression peaked, teeth bared in a display of raw terror, his eyes wild with recognition of the order's scent clinging to the man like invisible chains, a betrayal resurfacing from his brutal training days where handlers had whipped loyalty into fear. The dog lunged halfway, stopped only by Ben's sharp command, but the snarl persisted, a guttural explosion that flooded the air with tension mirroring Ben's internal turmoil, rage at the intrusion, clashing with the frozen grip of past loss, his fists clenching as if to fight ghosts. Dusk bled into night, the rural sky a canvas of bruised purples and black stars, hidden behind gathering clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in Ben's gut. The stranger returned not alone, flanked by two shadowy figures emerging from a black SUV parked at the field's edge, their cloaks whispering like secrets in the wind, the secret society materializing like phantoms from legend. "We are the Order of the Veil," the leader intoned, removing his glasses to reveal eyes cold as ancient stone, his face familiar in a way that chilled Ben, a match to the faded photo Ben had found tucked in Storm's old crate at the shelter, a relic tying the dog to prophecies of guardians and impending doom. "The dog is ours. He's the key to the prophecy sent to protect or destroy." The society's figures melted back into the night shadows, their retreat a slithering whisper across the gravel drive, leaving the porch awash in the harsh glow of Ben's flashlight beam trembling in his grip. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of adrenaline, and earth churned by frantic footsteps, the rural silence reclaiming the space like a breath held too long, finally released. Ben lowered the shovel, his shoulders slumping as exhaustion crashed over him, but his eyes sought Storm first. The dog standing rigid, breaths heaving, fur still bristled like a crown of thorns. Sophie rushed to Storm, burying her face in his neck, her small body shaking with sobs muffled against his warmth, whispering, "You saved us, boy." Storm's tail gave a faint wag, his body leaning into her, a silent affirmation that bridged the chaos, his amber eyes meeting Ben's in a gaze laden with shared resolve. Dawn broke unevenly over the rural landscape, fractured light filtering through the blinds like fingers probing for secrets, the house a fortress now laced with unease. Ben paced the kitchen, coffee forgotten, and cold, his eyes darting to the windows, where cryptic symbols, swirling runes like those from the fallen barn, had appeared overnight, etched in dew on the glass, vanishing as the sun rose, but leaving chills in their wake. Storm patrolled the perimeter inside his paws, silent on the floor, ears swiveling at every creak, body language a tapestry of watchfulness, tail-low hackles, subtly raised nose, twitching at the faint, unnatural scent wafting from outside, like incense mingled with ozone, a hallmark of the Order's approach. Sophie, unusually quiet, clutched her drawing pad, sketching the symbols she'd glimpsed, her intuition, whispering of hidden dangers. "They're coming back, Daddy. Storm knows." Night descended like a predator's cloak over the rural fields, the moon a sliver of silver barely piercing the thick clouds that gathered with ominous intent, mirroring the society's relentless advance. Ben barricaded the final window, his hands slick with sweat, the wood splintering under nails hammered in haste, but the creak of the door bursting open shattered the illusion of safety, the leader of the Order striding in, flanked by hooded figures, their eyes gleaming with fanatical zeal, cloaks billowing like wings of darkness. "The prophecy demands the guardian," the leader snarled, his voice a blade cutting through the air, thick with the scent of incense and impending violence, a ritual dagger glinting in his hand as he lunged toward Sophie, who screamed, her small body backing into the corner, eyes wide with terror. The room spun in a vortex of chaos, the society's chants rising like a gale-force wind, ethereal energies crackling in the air, pulling at the veil between worlds. With a hum that vibrated through Ben's bones, the scent of blood and incense choking the space. Ben clutched his bleeding side vision, tunneling as weakness threatened to claim him. Sophie huddled behind Storm, her sobs a dagger to his heart, the leader's eyes locking onto his with triumphant malice. Choose the dog or your daughter. The moment crystallized, cinematic in its intensity, time slowing as Ben's internal storm raged surrender. Storm, the guardian who'd mended their broken souls, or risk everything in a final stand, echoes of Lily's loss screaming that sacrifice was inevitable. Yet Storm's loyal gaze, amber depths pleading not fear, but unity, ignited a spark in Ben's chest. The first light of dawn seeped through the shattered windows like hesitant fingers tracing wounds, casting a pale glow over the rural home's disarray. Overturned chairs sprawled like fallen soldiers, bloodstains blooming on the floorboards in dark, irregular petals. Ben slumped against the wall, his side bandaged with torn strips from an old shirt, the fabric stiffening as blood dried each shallow breath, a labored sigh echoing in the quiet that had descended after the society's retreat. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of violence and the faint, acrid residue of their incense, a reminder that peace was but a fragile interlude. Sophie curled on the couch, her small form wrapped in a blanket, eyes fluttering in exhausted sleep, her hand still clutching Storm's collar as if afraid the night might steal him away. Weeks unfolded like pages in a worn book, the rural home gradually shedding its scars as Ben hammered nails into splintered wood, the rhythmic thud echoing his steady heartbeat, a tempo of recovery that wove through their days. The air carried the fresh scent of sawdust and rain-washed earth, sensory threads binding them in quiet ritual. Ben rising at dawn to brew coffee, its bitter aroma mingling with the warm musk of Storm's fur, as the dog followed him room to room, a shadow-turned companion. Storm's limp lessened with each passing day, his steps syncing with Ben's mirrored movements that spoke of intertwined paths. When Ben paused to flex his healing side, Storm would sit amber eyes, watchful, a subtle lean against his leg, offering silent support. Internally, Ben felt the shift grief's sharp edges dulling, replaced by a gentle warmth, the dog's presence a balm that echoed his own gradual thaw. Internally, Ben felt the weight lift grief's shadow receding like mist under sunlight. The act of walking together sealing the breakthrough fear's grip, broken replaced by a quiet strength rooted in their shared journey. The focus was intimate on Sophie's small hand in his. Storm's breath, puffing in rhythm the gentle sway of their steps as one. A faint breeze stirred, carrying a whisper of future challenges. The society's echo, not fully silenced, but in this moment, their side-by-side stride was a powerful emblem, a rebirth marked by motion and trust, the dawn's light bathing them in hope as they moved forward unbreakable into the day.